Hey there, tonight we're peeling away the rose-tinted tapestry of medieval romance and taking a long, hard look at why you'd absolutely dread your wedding night if you were born a noble girl in 14th century France. Imagine, just for a moment, you're not scrolling through Pinterest wedding boards in your cozy pajamas, but instead you're about to be traded like a prized heifer to seal a political deal you don't understand, for a man you've never met, in a ceremony that's really just a very expensive livestock transaction with better music. It's a world of blood-stained sheets, public humiliation, and the kind of wedding night that would make a horror movie director wince. Honestly, you probably won't survive this emotionally intact, and you definitely won't be posting any happy couple selfies afterward. So before we dive in, take a moment to appreciate that dating app you were complaining about earlier. At least you get to swipe left. Now, settle in, maybe grab that soft blanket, and let's ease into tonight's journey through the wedding from hell. Where I do really meant, I have absolutely no choice in this matter whatsoever. You don't get to plan your perfect day, of course, because you've been preparing for this moment since you could walk. Your name is Essel Doel. It might be, or it might be Marguerite or Blanche, because honestly, your individual identity matters about as much as a flea's opinion on castle architecture. You're 15 now, which in medieval terms makes you practically an old maid, if you're not already married off and producing heirs. From the moment you drew your first breath in that cold, drafty castle chamber, your destiny was sealed, not by the stars, not by divine providence, but by the simple biological fact that you were born with the wrong set of organs for medieval society. While your brothers learned to ride warhorses and swing swords, you learned to embroider, to be silent when men were speaking, and to keep your eyes downcast in a way that suggested virtue rather than defiance. Your education was carefully curated to make you the perfect political asset. You learned to read, but only religious texts and romantic poetry, nothing that might give you dangerous ideas about your own autonomy. You learned to manage a household, but only so you could efficiently run your future husband's domestic affairs. You learned to play the lute and sing sweetly, because nothing says valuable marriage commodity like a girl who can provide entertainment after dinner. But most importantly, you learned to be afraid of your own body. Your mother and the women who raised you filled your head with warnings about the terrible consequences of impurity, the absolute necessity of preserving your maidenhead for your wedding night, and the horrific shame that would befall your entire family if you failed to bleed properly when the time came. They spoke in hushed tones about girls who had ruined themselves through too much horseback riding, or dancing, or simply having the wrong sort of anatomy. The irony is delicious, really. You were taught that your most valuable asset was also your greatest vulnerability, that the very thing that made you precious in the marriage market was so fragile it could be destroyed by a vigorous sneeze. You learned to move carefully, to avoid any activity that might potentially damage your hymen, to live in constant fear of your own body betraying you before you even reached the altar. Meanwhile, your future husband, a man you wouldn't meet until your wedding day, was off gallivanting through Europe, learning about warfare and politics, and almost certainly gaining extensive sexual experience with servants, peasant girls, and prostitutes, because while your purity was sacred, his experience was considered not just acceptable but desirable. After all, someone in the marriage needed to know what they were doing, and it certainly wasn't going to be you. Your marriage negotiations began when you were 13, conducted entirely without your input or knowledge. Your father and his advisors would meet with potential suitors or their representatives in smoke-filled chambers, discussing your dowry, your bloodline, and your breeding potential as if you were a prize heifer being auctioned at market. The man who eventually won the bidding war for your hand is named Guillaume de Montfort, Robert de Clermont, or some other forgettably noble French name that sounds important but tells you nothing about whether he's kind, intelligent, or likely to beat you. His primary qualifications for marriage are that he owns strategic territory along the border with England, hasn't died of plague yet, and needs an alliance with your family to strengthen his position against his neighbors. He's 36 years old enough to be your father, and has already buried one wife who died in childbirth attempting to produce the male heir he desperately needs. You are wife number 2, chosen specifically for your youth, your proven fertility bloodline, and your family's military connections. Romance doesn't enter into the equation because romance is a luxury that noble families can't afford when survival is at stake. A particularly charming detail of medieval marriage negotiations was the practice of requiring medical examinations of potential brides. Your future mother-in-law sent her personal physician to examine you like a horse being evaluated for purchase, checking your teeth, your posture, your general health, and yes, your presumed virginity. You stood there in your shift while an elderly man poked and prodded and made notes about your suitability for breeding purposes. The dowry negotiations were extensive and brutal. Your father had to provide not just money and goods, but also political commitments, military support, and guarantees about your behavior and fertility. If you failed to produce a male heir within a reasonable time frame, portions of the dowry could be returned. If you were discovered to be unchaste, the entire marriage contract could be voided, and your family would be financially ruined. Meanwhile, you caught glimpses of your intended husband exactly once, from across a great hall during the formal betrothal ceremony. He was tall, stern-faced, and looked at you with the same expression a merchant might use when evaluating the quality of cloth. He exchanged perhaps 10 words with you, formal pleasantries about your health and your family, and then returned to discussing military strategy with your father. That brief encounter told you everything you needed to know about your future relationship. This wasn't a partnership or even a friendship in the making. This was a business arrangement with a religious ceremony attached, and you were the commodity being exchanged to seal the deal. The morning of your wedding arrives with all the joy of an execution date. You're awakened before dawn by a small army of women whose job it is to transform you from a person into a symbol. Your wedding dress isn't flowing silk or delicate lace, it's a monument to your family's wealth, so heavy with gold thread and precious stones that you need help just standing upright. The gown is a masterpiece of medieval engineering and excess. The fabric alone cost more than most peasant families would see in their entire lifetimes, and every stitch screams, "Look how much this alliance is worth." The sleeves are so long they trail on the ground, requiring a servant to carry them. The train extends several feet behind you, necessitating 2 more servants to manage it properly. You are quite literally a walking advertisement for your father's coffers, wrapped in cloth of gold and misery. The process of getting dressed is a form of torture in itself. The undergarments are layers upon layers of linen, creating a barrier between your skin and the outside world that feels symbolic in the worst possible way. The corset is laced so tightly you can barely breathe, which is probably for the best, because hyperventilating might be considered unseemly. Your hair is arranged in an elaborate style that requires pins and wires, creating a structure so rigid you can't turn your head properly. The final touch is the veil, a creation so thick and elaborate that it obscures your face almost completely. This isn't just bridal fashion, this is symbolic packaging. You're being literally veiled from the world because your thoughts, your expressions, your very face are no longer your own to control. From this moment forward, you belong to your husband as completely as his horse or his favorite hunting hound. Your jewelry is equally symbolic and equally uncomfortable. Heavy gold chains across your chest, rings on every finger, a circlet that feels more like a crown of thorns. Each piece represents an aspect of your family's wealth and your own worth as measured in precious metals. You jingle slightly when you move, like a very expensive wind chime, announcing your approach with the sound of gold against gold. The cathedral is packed with representatives from both families, local nobility, church officials, and anyone else who might have a political interest in witnessing this alliance. You process down the aisle to the sound of Latin chanting, unable to see properly through your veil, moving slowly because of the weight of your dress, and feeling like a ghost, attending your own funeral. The wedding ceremony itself is conducted entirely in Latin, which you understand only partially, making you a spectator at your own marriage. The priest drones on about duty, obedience, and the sacred bond of matrimony while you stand there trying not to faint from the heat, the weight of your clothes, and the crushing realization that there's no escape from what's happening. Your father places your hand in guillemets during the formal exchange, and you notice immediately how different his touch feels from anything you've experienced. His hands are rough, calloused from sword work and horse riding, and significantly larger than yours. Everything about him is significantly larger than you, which becomes increasingly relevant as the day progresses and night approaches. The vows you speak are not promises of love or commitment, but legal formulas acknowledging your transfer from one man's authority to another's. You promise to obey, to honor, to be a dutiful wife, but nowhere in the ceremony does anyone promise to cherish you, to consider your happiness, or to treat you as anything more than valuable property that happens to be capable of producing heirs. When Gigam places the ring on your finger, it feels less like a symbol of union and more like a shackle. The gold is heavy, ornate, and clearly expensive, but it's also a visible mark of ownership that you'll wear for the rest of your life. Married women in medieval society were legally considered the property of their husbands, with about as many rights as livestock and considerably more responsibilities. The kiss that seals your marriage is your first physical contact with the man who now legally owns your body. It's brief, formal, and completely devoid of any emotion beyond duty fulfilled. His lips are dry, his breath smells of wine, and his mustache scratches against your face in a way that makes you want to recoil. But recoiling isn't an option, because every eye in the cathedral is watching for your reaction. After the ceremony, you're paraded through the town in a procession designed to show off your family's wealth and the importance of this alliance. The common people line the streets to gawk at your finery, and you smile and wave as you've been trained to do, all while feeling like you're participating in your own public execution. The feast that follows is ostensibly in your honor, but you quickly realize that you're more decoration than guest at your own celebration. You sit beside your new husband at the high table, picking at food you can't taste through your terror, while men discuss politics, your dowry, your bloodline, and your breeding potential as if you're a prize Away who happens to be sitting right there. Guillaume speaks to you occasionally, brief questions about your health, your family, your education, but his attention is primarily focused on the political conversations happening around him. You're now his wife, his possession, his responsibility, but you're clearly not his priority. The men at your table are discussing military strategy, trade agreements, and territorial disputes while you sit there in your golden cage, smiling when appropriate and staying silent otherwise. The other women at the feast treat you with a mixture of pity and envy. The older matrons remember their own wedding days with expressions that suggest they're not particularly fond memories, while the younger unmarried girls look at you with a combination of fear and anticipation, knowing their own time will come soon enough. Wine flows freely for everyone except you. They want you sober and alert for what comes next. Your mother-in-law keeps watching you with calculating eyes, clearly assessing your suitability for the task ahead. Every so often, she leans over to whisper something to Gigam that makes him glance at you appraisingly, as if checking to make sure his purchase is still in good condition. The entertainment includes minstrels singing songs about courtly love and chivalric romance, which would be ironic if irony had been invented yet. These tales of passionate devotion and noble sacrifice are pure fantasy, as disconnected from your reality as stories about flying unicorns. The love they sing about is for other people, people who have the luxury of choosing their own romantic partners. As evening approaches, the tone of the celebration becomes more ribald. The men make increasingly explicit jokes about wedding night duties, while the women exchange meaningful glances about blood-stained sheets and morning inspections. Your stomach churns with anxiety as you realize that your ordeal is just beginning, not ending. As the feast winds down, you're subjected to one of medieval society's most charming traditions, the bedding ceremony. This delightful custom involves the wedding guests escorting you and Guillaume to your bridal chamber while singing bawdy songs and making crude jokes about the consummation to come. Imagine your drunk uncle making graphic observations about your virginity while your new mother-in-law critiques the thread count of your bed linens. The procession to the bridal chamber feels like a march to the gallows. The women surround you, supposedly offering support and advice, but their words ring hollow because everyone knows there's no backing out now. Some whisper encouragement about doing your duty. Others share vague hints about making your husband happy, but no one tells you what to actually expect beyond pain and the critical importance of bleeding afterward. The men escort Guillaume with considerably more enthusiasm, slapping him on the back and offering congratulations as if he's about to undertake some great achievement rather than exercise his legal right to have sex with his terrified teenage bride. Their jokes become progressively cruder as wine loosens their tongues, and you catch fragments about breaking in and taming that make your skin crawl. The bridal chamber has been prepared with all the ceremony of a religious ritual, which in many ways it is. Fresh linens, clean white sheets that everyone will examine tomorrow morning like forensic evidence. Candles flickering in iron sconces, casting dancing shadows that do nothing to calm your nerves. Rose petals scattered on the bed, a romantic touch that feels mockingly inappropriate given the circumstances. A particularly medieval touch is the presence of the official sheet inspector, usually an older woman from Guillaume's family, whose job it is to verify that consummation has occurred and that you were indeed a virgin. She examines the bed setup with the thoroughness of a general preparing for battle. Because in many ways, that's exactly what this is. Your ladies-in-waiting help you out of the elaborate wedding gown and into a simple linen shift your wedding night attire, which is essentially a shroud designed for easy removal. They brush your hair, murmur vague encouragements that ring hollow, and then leave you alone to wait for your husband. The silence that follows is deafening, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant sounds of the celebration continuing. Without you, when Guillaume finally arrives, he's clearly been drinking heavily wine on his breath, slightly unsteady gait, and the particular confidence that comes from alcohol and absolute legal authority over another human being. He barely looks at you as he begins removing his own clothes, and you realize that any fantasy you might have harbored about gentle romance dies. Right there on the stone floor with his discarded tunic. Your training for this moment has been brutally simple. Be silent, be obedient, and prepare to bleed. Your mother delivered these instructions with the emotional warmth of someone discussing livestock breeding. But the gravity in her voice made it clear that your entire future depends on your performance tonight. Not your pleasure, not your comfort, not your emotional well-being, just your ability to provide the physical evidence that medieval society demands. What follows is clinical, painful, and mercifully brief. There's no tenderness, no consideration for your fear or inexperience. Guillaume approaches the task with the same mechanical efficiency he might use to break in a new horse. Necessary work that requires getting the job done properly, but doesn't warrant any particular emotional investment. You've been trained to lie still and endure, which is exactly what you do, staring at the tapestry on the wall and trying to disappear into its woven hunting scenes. The pain is sharp and unexpected, different from anything you've experienced before, and you bite your lip to keep from crying out, because showing distress might be interpreted as resistance or inadequate preparation. When it's over, Guillaume rolls away without a word, already half asleep from wine and exertion. You're left lying there feeling torn and bruised and fundamentally changed, though you're not sure exactly how. The fire in the hearth continues crackling cheerfully, as if nothing significant has happened, while you try to process the fact that this brief, unpleasant encounter is apparently what all the fuss has been about. But the real nightmare hasn't even begun yet, because now you have to face the morning inspection that will determine whether your body has performed according to medieval mythology. You wake to discover that the ache between your legs is the least of your problems. The sheets beneath you are pristine white, unmarked by the red stain that medieval society demanded as proof of your virginity and successful consummation. Your body, for whatever biological, psychological, or simply random reason, hasn't produced the theatrical blood display that everyone expects. The science behind this is actually quite straightforward, though it would be centuries before anyone understood it properly. Many factors can affect whether a woman bleeds during first intercourse: natural anatomical variation, level of physical activity, stress responses, or simple biological diversity. Some women have thicker hymens, others have virtually none. Some tear easily, others stretch. Some bleed dramatically, others produce barely a spot. It's completely normal biological variation. But normal science wasn't exactly medieval society's strong suit when women's reputations were at stake. Your heart pounds as you examine the evidence, or rather, the complete lack of evidence. You know with growing horror that this pristine white sheet is about to become the most important document in your life, more significant than your marriage contract, your dowry agreement, or any legal charter. This piece of cloth will be scrutinized, analyzed, and interpreted by people who will use its blank surface to make sweeping judgments about your moral character. The matron arrives early to conduct the official inspection, a ritual so common it was considered standard wedding procedure among noble families. Her face falls when she sees the unstained linen, and you watch in horror as disappointment transforms into suspicion, then hardens into accusation. This girl has lied about her purity, she announces to the gathering crowd of family members and servants who have assembled for this humiliating spectacle. Your new husband is furious, though whether from genuine anger or wounded pride is unclear. His honor has been questioned, his investment potentially compromised, his judgment called into doubt. How could he have failed to properly evaluate his bride's condition before the wedding? What does this say about his ability to manage his own household? In his mind, you've made him look like a fool in front of his family and allies. Your mother-in-law's face hardens into a mask of disgust and calculation. She's spent considerable effort arranging this marriage, negotiating terms, and preparing for the integration of a new family member. Now she's faced with potential scandal, possible annulment proceedings, and the nightmare of having to return your dowry while explaining to everyone why the marriage failed. The whispers spread through the household like wildfire. The new bride was not a virgin. The marriage may not be valid. The alliance might be worthless. Servants exchange meaningful glances. Family members huddle in urgent conferences, and you find yourself at the center of a political crisis that's entirely beyond your control, but somehow entirely your fault. Your own family's reaction when they receive word of the morning's revelations is perhaps the most devastating blow of all. Instead of rallying to your defense, instead of questioning the validity of a system that judges women's worth by their ability to bleed on command, they immediately assume your guilt and begin calculating the political damage. Your father's first concern isn't your well-being or the injustice of your situation, it's the potential impact on his carefully constructed web of alliances. If your marriage is annulled, he'll have to return Gwilym's family payments, forfeit political agreements, and face the humiliation of having a defective daughter. His reputation as a shrewd negotiator and reliable ally is at stake, and you're the liability threatening everything he's worked to build. Your mother's reaction is even more painful because it's so deeply personal. The woman who raised you, who should understand better than anyone the arbitrary nature of biology, joins the chorus of accusation with barely disguised fury. She's spent years training you for this moment, drilling into you the absolute importance of preserving your maidenhead, and now she feels personally betrayed by your body's failure to cooperate. How could you deceive us? She demands, during the tense family conference that follows the morning inspection. How could you lie about your purity? Do you have any idea what you've done to our family's honor? The irony is bitter. You've done absolutely nothing wrong, but the system is so designed that someone must be blamed, and that someone is always the woman. Your brothers, who should be defending your honor, instead discuss you like a failed business investment. They worry about how your scandal might affect their own marriage prospects, their political careers, their standing in society. Not one of them questions whether a system that destroys women based on biological lottery might be fundamentally flawed. Even your female relatives, who should understand the impossible position you're in, join the pylon with enthusiasm. Your aunts and older female cousins shake their heads sadly and make pointed comments about proper preparation and moral instruction. They've all survived their own wedding nights successfully, meaning they bled appropriately, so they see your failure as evidence of some personal deficiency rather than random biological chance. That the speed with which your own family abandons you is breathtaking. Within hours of the failed inspection, they're already discussing damage control strategies that involve distancing themselves from you as completely as possible. You've gone from beloved daughter to family liability in less time than it takes to eat breakfast. When the sheet evidence proves insufficient, or rather, when it fails to provide the evidence everyone demands, Gwilym's family calls for more definitive proof of your alleged deception. A local midwife is summoned to perform what they euphemistically call a virginity examination, but which is really just sanctioned assault disguised as medical procedure. The woman who arrives to conduct this examination is old, experienced in the ways of medieval gynecology, and utterly convinced of her own expertise despite having no actual medical training beyond folklore and superstition. She's performed dozens of these examinations over the years, and she approaches your body with the confident ignorance of someone who's never questioned whether her methods have any scientific validity. You're forced to submit to an invasive, humiliating procedure conducted in front of several witnesses, because your humiliation must be thoroughly documented. Apparently, your legs are held apart while strangers discuss the state of your most private parts, as if you're a horse being examined for soundness. The midwife pokes and prods with unwashed hands, makes pronouncements based on completely unscientific observations, and describes her findings in terms that reduce you to a collection of anatomical features. The pain is excruciating, but any reaction on your part is interpreted as further evidence of guilt. If you cry out, you're being dramatic. If you try to close your legs, you're being uncooperative. If you show any sign of distress, you're demonstrating the shame that proves your deception. There's no response that doesn't somehow confirm that predetermined conclusion. The midwife's examination reveals exactly what any competent modern doctor could have told them. Anatomy varies, hymens come in different configurations, and physical examination cannot reliably determine sexual history. But medieval medicine doesn't traffic in such nuanced understanding. She declares the results inconclusive when your anatomy doesn't conform to their mythical expectations, which in the context of this witch trial, masquerading as medical procedure, might as well be a guilty verdict. When the midwife's findings don't satisfy your accusers, and really, how could they, since they're demanding scientific evidence for something that science can't actually prove? Guillaume's father calls for ecclesiastical intervention, because if there's one thing medieval society loved more than public humiliation, it was public humiliation with religious authority backing it up. The local priest, a man who presumably took vows of celibacy and knows absolutely nothing about female anatomy beyond what he's read in theological texts written by other celibate men, will now weigh in on the state of your hymen. The irony would be delicious if your entire future didn't hang in the balance. The ecclesiastical examination that follows is a masterpiece of medieval logic, combining theological dogma, medical ignorance, and institutional misogyny into one perfectly crafted instrument of destruction. The priest approaches your case with the serene confidence of someone who believes that God will reveal truth through his divinely inspired judgment, even though his qualifications for assessment begin and end with his ability to read Latin. The procedure takes place in the chapel, because apparently violating your bodily autonomy is more acceptable when conducted in a sacred space. You're required to kneel before the altar while the priest, the midwife, and various family representatives discuss your case as if you're not present. They debate theological fine points about purity, corruption, and divine judgment while you kneel there in your shift, waiting for them to decide your fate. The priest's examination is even more invasive than the midwife's, conducted with a kind of thoroughness usually reserved for investigating major heresies. He prays over your body, asks for divine guidance, and makes pronouncements about spiritual corruption that somehow require extensive physical investigation. The whole proceeding has the surreal quality of a religious ceremony designed by people who've confused piety with prurience. When he finally renders his verdict, it's delivered with the authority of someone speaking directly for God himself. Your body, he declares, shows signs of corruption that are consistent with moral impurity. Never mind that he has no medical training, no understanding of anatomy, and no scientific basis for his conclusions. He's a man of God, and in medieval society that trumps everything else. The theological reasoning behind his judgment is a masterpiece of circular logic. Virtuous women bleed on their wedding nights because God designed their bodies to provide proof of their purity. If he didn't bleed, it's because God is revealing your hidden corruption. Your failure to produce the expected physical evidence is itself evidence of spiritual failure, which retroactively justifies the original accusation. This divine sanction transforms your personal tragedy into a moral lesson for the entire community. You're not just a woman whose body failed to conform to biological mythology or a cautionary tale about the consequences of deception. A living reminder of what happens to girls who try to fool God and man about their purity. The church inquest concludes with a finding that surprises absolutely no one. Your marriage is declared invalid due to fraud in the marriage contract. You allegedly deceived Guillaume's family about your virginal status, which constitutes grounds for annulment and complete dissolution of all associated agreements. Never mind that you were a virgin, your body's failure to produce theatrical evidence is treated as proof of deception. The legal proceedings that follow are swift and brutal. Guillaume's family files for immediate annulment, demanding return of all wedding gifts, dissolution of political agreements, and financial compensation for their troubles. Your family, faced with potential financial ruin, agrees to everything, rather than contest the charges in a system where women's testimony carries virtually no weight. You're not permitted to speak in your own defense during these proceedings. Medieval law generally didn't recognize women's right to testify in their own cases, particularly when their moral character was in question. You sit in silence while men debate your future, your reputation, and your fate as if you're a disputed piece of property rather than a human being with thoughts and feelings. The speed of your erasure is breathtaking. Within days of the failed inspection, your marriage is dissolved. Your name is removed from family records, and your very existence is treated as an embarrassing mistake that everyone wants to forget. Legal documents are rewritten as if you never existed. Alliances are renegotiated without you, and the political landscape adjusts around your absence as if you were never part of it. Guillaume, meanwhile, is already negotiating his next marriage. His reputation is not only intact, but potentially enhanced. He's demonstrated his commitment to purity and his refusal to accept damaged goods. The same system that destroys you for failing to bleed properly will reward him for his moral fortitude in rejecting an impure bride. The financial consequences for your family are severe but manageable, because they've planned for this possibility. From the beginning, wealthy families always included clauses in marriage contracts that would protect them if brides turned out to be defective. Your father loses money, face, and political standing, but he still has sons who can make advantageous marriages and daughters who hopefully won't repeat your failures. With your marriage dissolved and your reputation destroyed, you're faced with extremely limited options for your future. Unmarriageable noble daughters don't just disappear, they need to be warehoused somewhere that won't remind everyone of their family's shame. Enter the convent, medieval society's solution for inconvenient women who can't be profitably married off. You're packed off to the Sisters of St. Clair, like damaged merchandise being returned to the manufacturer. Your family makes a substantial donation to ensure your acceptance, essentially paying the church to take you off their hands permanently. The nuns receive you with a mixture of pity and suspicion. Even women who've dedicated their lives to God have absorbed society's attitudes about female purity and moral failure. The convent itself is a grim, stone fortress designed more for containment than comfort. Your cell is tiny, cold, and furnished with only the most basic necessities: a narrow bed, a wooden stool, a small table for prayer books. The windows are high and narrow, offering minimal light and no view of the outside world. It's less a religious retreat than a prison for women whose existence has become inconvenient. Your daily routine is structured around prayer, manual labor, and contemplation of your sins. You rise before dawn for morning prayers, spend the day copying manuscripts or doing laundry, and end with evening prayers that feel more like penance than worship. The other nuns treat you with careful distance. You're not really one of them since you haven't taken formal vows, but you're not free to leave either. The work assigned to you is deliberately humbling: scrubbing floors, washing laundry, tending the vegetable garden, and copying religious texts that emphasized female obedience and the dangers of moral corruption. You spend hours each day hand-copying sermons about the importance of virginity, the sinfulness of deception, and the proper submission of women to male authority. The irony is not lost on you. Food in the convent is simple and deliberately austere: porridge, bread, weak ale, and vegetables from the garden. There's no comfort eating here, no indulgence in pleasant flavors or satisfying meals. Even the act of nourishment is designed to remind you of your fallen state and the need for constant penance. Years pass in the grey monotony of convent life, and you watch yourself slowly disappearing piece by piece. The young woman who once embroidered elaborate tapestries and played the lute for noble guests becomes a shadow of herself, existing in the margins of a world that has moved on without her. Your hands, once soft and skilled at delicate work, become rough from scrubbing stone floors and washing coarse linen. Your reflection in the convent's single mirror becomes increasingly unfamiliar. Your face grows gaunt from the austere diet and constant stress. Your posture becomes permanently stooped from hours of manual labor, and your eyes develop the hollow look of someone who's given up hope of escape. You're aging rapidly in this place, not just physically but spiritually, as if the very air sucks the life out of everything it touches. The other nuns speak to you in hushed tones about acceptance, about finding peace in God's plan, about the value of suffering for spiritual growth. But their words ring hollow because everyone knows you're not here by choice. You're here because there was nowhere else to put you. Your presence is a constant reminder of what happens to women who fail to meet society's impossible standards. Letter writing is forbidden except under strict supervision, and your family's correspondence becomes increasingly infrequent until it stops altogether. They've moved on with their lives, arranging new alliances, making new plans, and pretending you never existed. Your younger sister marries, successfully, apparently having learned from your failure to produce more convincing evidence of purity. Your brothers advance in their careers without the burden of an embarrassing sister to explain. Sleep becomes your only escape. But even your dreams are haunted by that wedding night, that morning inspection, that moment when your entire life changed based on something completely beyond your control. You relive the humiliation over and over, searching for some different choice you could have made, some way you could have prevented this outcome, but there was never any choice involved. You were doomed from the moment you failed to bleed on command. The seasons pass with numbing regularity, cold winters spent huddled near inadequate fires, hot summers laboring in the garden, spring and autumn marked only by changes in the vegetables you're required to tend. Time loses meaning when every day is identical, when there's no future to plan for and no past worth remembering. Your story doesn't end with your exile, it echoes through the generations of women who come after you, creating a legacy of fear and self-hatred that will poison your family tree for decades. Your younger sister approaches her own wedding night with a level of terror that borders on hysteria, absolutely determined to produce convincing blood evidence, no matter what it costs her physically or emotionally. She goes to extreme lengths to ensure her sheets will show red, including deliberately injuring herself before her wedding night to guarantee bleeding. The pain she inflicts on herself is excruciating, but it's preferable to the social death that awaits women who fail to perform according to medieval mythology. Her wedding night becomes an exercise in self-mutilation disguised as proof of virtue. Female cousins grow up hearing whispered warnings about your disgrace. They're taught to fear their own bodies, to see their anatomy as potential evidence against them, to approach their sexuality with terror rather than any hope of pleasure or intimacy. The trauma becomes hereditary, passed down through generations of women like a family curse that no one knows how to break. The men in your family use your story as a cautionary tale. When arranging marriages for other daughters, remember what happened to a soldier, they say, as if your suffering was a choice you made rather than a biological lottery you lost. Your very name becomes synonymous with family shame, your existence reduced to a warning about the importance of managing daughters more carefully. Meanwhile, the systems that destroyed you continue unchanged. Other girls are married off to strangers. Other wedding nights end in humiliation and accusation. Other women are discarded when their bodies fail to perform as medieval mythology demands. Your individual tragedy is absorbed into the larger machinery. Triumphant control, just another cog in a system designed to reduce women to their reproductive functions and sexual status. The most bitter irony is that many of the same families demanding virginity tests and blood-stained sheets from their daughters-in-law simultaneously maintain elaborate networks of mistresses, visit prostitutes regularly, and father children outside marriage without any social consequences whatsoever. The purity they demand from women is a privilege they never extend to themselves. A double standard so blatant it would be laughable if it weren't destroying lives. Your story becomes a ghost story of sorts, whispered among women as both warning and lament. Mothers tell daughters about the girl who failed to bleed. Servants share tales of the bride who disappeared, and female relatives speak your name in hushed tones when discussing the importance of wedding night preparation. You become a cautionary tale, a boogeyman used to frighten young women into compliance. As the years stretch into decades, you develop a strange kind of numbness that passes for peace. The sharp edges of your grief were smoothed with time, leaving behind a dull ache that becomes as familiar as breathing. You learn to find small pleasures in your constrained existence. The way morning light filters through the chapel windows, the satisfaction of perfectly copied calligraphy, the rare moments of genuine kindness from other women trapped in this place. Your skills as a scribe become valuable to the convent, and you're eventually assigned to the scriptorium full-time, copying religious texts, legal documents, and occasionally the romantic literature that feels like messages from another world. Your handwriting becomes famous in certain circles, precise, beautiful, and utterly reliable. It's a small form of recognition in a life otherwise devoid of acknowledgement. The irony of spending your days copying love stories isn't lost on you. You transcribe tales of courtly romance, passionate devotion, and noble sacrifice while living the reality of what happens to women when the fairy tales end. Your elegant script brings these fantasies to life for other people, while serving as a constant reminder of everything you'll never experience. Some of the younger nuns, women who chose religious life rather than having it forced upon them, occasionally try to befriend you. They offer sympathy, share their own stories of loss and disappointment, and attempt to include you in their spiritual community. But there's always a barrier between you and them, an understanding that your presence here is fundamentally different from theirs. You become a repository of practical knowledge for the convent, which herbs help with monthly pain, how to treat minor injuries, what foods help prevent scurvy during long winters. Your noble education, combined with decades of practical experience, makes you valuable in ways that have nothing to do with marriage or reproduction. It's perhaps the only area of your life where you have any agency or expertise that's genuinely respected. The seasonal rhythms of convent life become your new calendar. Planting season in the garden, harvest time for the herbs you dry and store, the long dark months when copying manuscripts by candlelight strains your eyes, the brief bright summers when the stone walls seem almost cheerful. Time passes, not in years, but in cycles of work, prayer, and quiet endurance. Occasionally, news from the outside world penetrates the convent walls, usually through new arrivals or visiting clergy. You learn that Guillaume remarried within months of your annulment, choosing a 13-year-old girl from a family eager to ally themselves with his house. His new bride apparently bled satisfactorily on her wedding night and has since produced 3 children, including the male heir he desperately needed. Your replacement wife dies in childbirth at age 19, worn out by repeated pregnancies and the general harshness of medieval life. Guillaume's third wife lasts longer. She makes it to 25 before succumbing to some wasting disease that might have been cancer, tuberculosis, or simply exhaustion. He's now shopping for wife number 4, and the cycle continues unchanged. Your father dies when you're 32, and you learn about it weeks later through a chance conversation between visiting priests. No one thought to inform you you've been so thoroughly erased from family records that your own father's death isn't considered relevant to your existence. The man who sold you into marriage and then abandoned you when the sale went bad passes from this world without giving you a second thought. Your mother follows him within 2 years, and again you learn about it accidentally. The woman who trained you for a life that destroyed you, who blamed you for your body's failure to conform to mythology, who chose family reputation over her daughter's well-being, dies without ever attempting to contact you or express regret for her role in your downfall. Your brothers thrive in their chosen careers, using the political connections and family wealth that your sacrifice helped preserve. They marry advantageously, father legitimate heirs, and build the kind of successful lives that were never an option for you. None of them ever inquire about your welfare or wonder whether you might be suffering in your exile. As decades pass, you begin to hear whispers of changes in the outside world that might have made your life different if you'd been born a generation later. The printing press is spreading throughout Europe, making books more common and literacy more widespread. Universities are beginning to admit a few exceptional women. Some noble families are allowing their daughters slightly more say in marriage arrangements. But these changes come too late for you and too slowly to help most women. The fundamental structures that destroy your life remain firmly in place. Women are still considered property. Marriage is still primarily a business transaction, and female worth is still measured primarily by sexual purity and reproductive capacity. Progress, when it comes at all, comes at a glacial pace. You hear stories of women who've managed to carve out small spaces of autonomy within the system, abbesses who wield real political power, queens who influenced policy, scholars who write important works despite social constraints. These exceptional women give you hope for future generations, while highlighting how trapped your own generation remains. The Renaissance is dawning in Italy, bringing new ideas about human dignity, individual worth, and personal agency. But these revolutionary concepts are initially applied primarily to men, and it will be centuries before women are included in discussions of natural rights and individual freedom. You live in the twilight of the medieval world, just early enough to suffer under its full weight, but too early to benefit from the changes coming in your quieter moments. Usually during the long hours of copying manuscripts, you find yourself reflecting on the arbitrary nature of the forces that shaped your life. A slightly different anatomy, a more stressful wedding night, a family more willing to challenge social conventions, a society with better understanding of biology. Any of these factors might have changed everything. You think about the thousands, of other women who've suffered similar fates. The countless lives destroyed by a system that demanded impossible proof of impossible purity. You wonder how many marriages have been dissolved, how many families destroyed, how many women discarded because their bodies failed to perform according to masculine fantasies about female anatomy. The waste of it all overwhelms you sometimes. All the potential that's been squandered, all the contributions that women might have made if they'd been valued for their minds rather than their hymens. All the love and partnership that's been sacrificed on the altar of male insecurity and social control. Your personal tragedy is just one thread in a vast tapestry of systematic oppression. You've become an expert on the literature of courtly love through your copying work, and the contrast between romantic fantasy and lived reality strikes you as almost obscene. The knights and ladies of these tales pursue grand passions and noble loves, while real women are bought and sold like livestock. Their worth determined by their ability to bleed on command. In your more bitter moments, you imagine writing your own story, a counter-narrative to all the romantic literature you've copied. A truthful account of what marriage actually meant for women in your world. But women's voices weren't considered worth preserving, and your story would never survive, even if you dared to write it. As you enter your 50s, an age that makes you ancient by medieval standards, you find a strange kind of peace in having survived so long in a world that tried to destroy you completely. Your hair is grey, your hands are gnarled from decades of manual labor, and your back is permanently curved from hunching over manuscripts, but you're still here. That persistence feels like a small victory against a system designed to erase inconvenient women. The younger nuns sometimes ask you about life outside the convent walls, and you find yourself serving as an unofficial historian of women's experiences. You tell them about the realities of noble marriage, the politics of family alliances, and the impossible standards that women are expected to meet. Your stories serve as both education and warning. You've outlived Guillaume, who died in his 60s from some combination of war wounds, disease, and the general wear of medieval life. You've outlived most of your family, most of your contemporaries, and many of the systems that destroyed you. The specific people who orchestrated your downfall are gone, but the structures they represented continue unchanged. Your eyesight is failing from decades of close work by candlelight, and your copying days are numbered. The convent has begun, transitioning you to less demanding work, tending the herb garden, teaching young nuns basic literacy, managing the small library of books you've helped create over the years. It's peaceful work that allows you to reflect on a life that's been far longer than you expected when you first arrived here in disgrace. You find yourself increasingly grateful for small mercies, a sunny day in the garden, a perfectly formed letter on parchment, a moment of genuine laughter with another nun. These tiny pleasures feel precious because you've learned not to expect grand happiness or dramatic fulfillment. Survival itself has become your greatest achievement. Your story, though it will never be officially recorded, lives on in the whispered conversations between women. Mothers continue to warn daughters about the importance of wedding night performance, but some begin to question why such an arbitrary biological event should determine a woman's entire fate. Your suffering plants seeds of doubt about the justice of systems that destroy women for failing to meet impossible standards. The young nuns you've mentored carry forward a different understanding of women's worth, one that values intelligence, kindness, and spiritual depth over sexual purity and reproductive capacity. They may not be able to change the world overnight, but they represent a small shift in consciousness that might eventually grow into larger transformations. Your story becomes part of a larger oral tradition of women's resistance and survival. Other nuns tell similar tales of women who've been discarded by families, abandoned by husbands, or punished for failing to conform to social expectations. These stories create a hidden network of solidarity and understanding among women who learn to find strength in each other when the larger world offers none. The manuscripts you've copied will outlast you by centuries, carrying forward both the romantic fantasies that justified your oppression and the religious texts that condemned women like you. But they also preserved the skill and artistry of women's hands, the evidence that female minds were capable of complex intellectual work, even when society refused to acknowledge it. As evening falls on your life, and the candles are lit for evening prayers, you find yourself surprisingly at peace with a story that has no happy ending in any conventional sense. You never knew romantic love, never bore children, never experienced the simple pleasure of choosing your own path. But you also never had to watch daughters sold off as you were, never had to participate in the cycle of abuse that claimed you, never had to pretend that a brutal system was actually protective and loving. Your survival itself is a form of resistance, a refusal to disappear completely even when every force in society works to erase you. You've preserved knowledge, created beauty through your careful copying, and provided wisdom to younger women navigating the same treacherous waters that nearly drowned you. These aren't grand achievements, but they're real ones, earned through decades of quiet persistence. The convent bells ring for evening prayers, and you make your way slowly to the chapel where you've spent thousands of hours over the decades. The familiar Latin phrases wash over you like a prayer for peace, and you find genuine comfort in the ritual, even though you never chose this religious life. You've made it your own through sheer duration and stubborn endurance. Your story serves as a reminder that the good old days were often nightmarish for the people who lived through them, particularly women. The romantic medieval marriage we see in movies and novels was always a fantasy, a story told by and for people who never had to experience the reality of being reduced to a political chess piece, whose worth was determined by their ability to bleed on command. As our journey through this particular medieval nightmare draws to a close, perhaps you're feeling a renewed appreciation for the simple fact that you can choose your own romantic partners, that your worth isn't determined by your sexual history, that your wedding night won't be subject to public inspection and expert testimony about the state of your hymen. The story of Iseldan, the thousands of real women she represents, reminds us that progress isn't inevitable, that the rights and freedoms we take for granted were hard-won by generations of women who suffered under systems designed to control and diminish them. Their pain wasn't meaningless if it helps us recognize and protect the autonomy we have today. So as you drift off to sleep in your comfortable bed, in your private room, free to love whom you choose and live as you please, spare a thought for all the Isoldes who never had those options. Their stories matter, especially because they don't have fairy tale endings. They remind us that human dignity and women's rights are fragile achievements that must be actively protected and continually expanded. The medieval world fades into shadow now, taking its blood-stained sheets and impossible standards with it. But the lessons remain, that systems of oppression are human creations that can be changed, that woman's worth has never been determined by their anatomy or sexual history, and that every generation has the responsibility to do better than the one before it. Tomorrow you'll wake up in a world where women's bodies belong to themselves, where marriage is a choice rather than a transaction, where your value isn't measured by your ability to bleed on command. It's not a perfect world. Women still face discrimination, violence, and systemic barriers, but it's a world where Isolde's story could never unfold in quite the same way. Sweet dreams, and remember you are living in the fairy tale ending that women like Isolde could only dream of, the future they helped create through their suffering and their stubborn refusal to disappear completely. Their pain bought the freedom you now enjoy, and their stories remind us never to take that freedom for granted. Sleep well, knowing that the worst nightmares of the past are just stories now, shadows that can't reach you in your safe, warm bed, where you're free to dream of whatever future you choose to create.